Greetings, folks. This is Scott, and you're tuning into A Woman's Place, the podcast where we break down all the policies and politics that affect the 51%. That's right, women are half the US population, and Ashley and I are here to give you the facts about how today's events are affecting them. Find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Good morning, Ashley Brown. How are you today?
I'm good, Scott. How are you?
Excellent. Beautiful day. I am really good, and we have a fun topic to talk about today.
I mean, pay equity, does it get any better? Does it get any more
This is our
exciting?
commitment to facts, boy. We've got a lot of good facts on this one. But as I was preparing, I was thinking to myself, can we get, other than reproductive freedoms, can we get a more foundational topic if we don't have economic independence? Can we have independence on anything else? So it's pretty fundamental.
I think economic security is a key and a foundation to a life rooted in security, right? Without it, you don't have anything.
Absolutely. So before we get in, let's just recap that last episode, we talked with Elizabeth Spahn
Mhm.
on the moment of conception. Fascinating topic. We will be bringing her back for two more sessions, one on conception in law, how it has been interpreted, and one on the science of it. She's a wonderful researcher and speaker. So if you haven't listened to that session, absolutely check it out and stay tuned for the new ones coming up.
And Scott, I just wanted on the recap of that. I think it's still just surprising to me, which I think when things are surprising to me, they should be to others. So maybe I'm giving myself too much credit. But the fact that it really was the 1980s before some of our really religious organizations got involved in the discussion. So I think for so many people, it's easy to think it's always been this way, and it really hasn't. So I just wanted to highlight that one more time.
Absolutely. And I should say we're talking about Western Christianity,
Yes, yes, yes,
especially,
yes.
and how that is influenced. But that has been the dominant influence in the US that has looked at the issue of reproductive rights. And it's true. I suspect if you ask most people, they would think that the understanding of the moment of conception and reproductive rights and abortion issues has been settled in religious theology for hundreds of years, and that is far from the case. So,
So anyway, just
worth a
interesting.
listen.
Yes.
Today we're on gender pay gap, and as I like to say, the gender wealth gap, which is as or more important. Do you want to say anything that happened this week, or should we just dive in?
There's so many, there's so many things that have happened this week. Um, I would just like to point out we have such a global take on the world, but so much happens locally and at the state level, and just encourage people to stay engaged with what's happening because these are the things that have the biggest impact on your day to day. And in the state of Florida, there was a fetal personhood bill that passed the house this week. So just something to keep an eye on. And because when we look at economic independence and economic freedom, family planning and choice play a role in that. So while it might not seem connected, it all is.
It all is. And the Florida legislature is not in session for very long. So while they are in session, it's important to see what they're doing, no question.
Mhm.
Okay, so today, however, is the global pay and wealth gap. And I know we want to talk about what we see. Start with what we see and then why, where this comes from, and what perhaps we can do about it. So let's start with what we see. And I'm glad you mentioned global because I think it's important to recognize this is a global phenomenon. Many people hear the statistic that women make, let's just say 80 cents to the dollar that a man makes. And that's, of course, an average. Black and brown women and Hispanic women make less, white women make a little bit more, etc. It's an average, but it has been consistent for over 20 years now. Before that, there were these growths, 70s, 80s, but it has been consistent and really plateaued at about that level for over 20 years. Globally, the number is very, very similar. It averages between 77 cents to maybe 85 cents to the dollar. So year in and year out, women do not make as much as men. And we're going to talk about all the things that translates into, but that is consistent. It is backed up by so much data and so much very objective information. This should not be one that's subject to beliefs or politics. It's pretty factual right there.
Mm-hmm.
And I will say that the wealth gap, the asset gap, what women can accumulate, they have in their name, what they have to draw upon, or perhaps what they have to retire on, the gap is even smaller. All these pay gaps accumulate, and the gap of wealth gap is between 32 to 55 cents, again, to every dollar that a man has. So we're talking from a half to two-thirds less than what an average comparable man would make. So I often say this is why we think about older women in retirement is a poverty issue very often,
Mhm.
and it steamrolls onto so many other issues. And I know you've looked at it in Florida also. So the global we know is there, the US is there. I know you've looked at it in Florida in particular, and in Sarasota, we have our own unique
Yeah.
issues on it, don't we?
Well, and interesting in Sarasota County, and this data is from a report that was actually released in 2020. So it's um my guess is it's even exacerbated at this point. But in Florida, women had a gap of 58% for the median retirement income. So women had, are you ready for this? A median retirement income of $12,204 a
Oh,
year.
wow.
Well, men had not much better, but 21,170, which is 58%. And in Sarasota County, it's really similar. It was 57%. Women were $13,792 of retirement income a year.
And we know women typically live longer. How much is connected to that? I'm just sort of thinking through the statistics. Is that really the issue, or is it just that they're going into retirement with so much less?
Well, I think an indicator of that, and this kind of ties back to our care economy conversation.
Hmm.
Actually, when you look at just let's do Social Security income. Let's not even talk about did you have assets to invest and you're dealing with investment income. But for the median Social Security income for women was 12,652 versus
Hmm.
18,000, a little over 18,000. So almost a
Hmm.
70%, 69% gap. So
Hmm.
that's significant. So it's what are you paying in? What is your work trajectory? When we talk about the impact of the care economy to
Yes, yes.
wage earning, this is when it comes to roost is when you're at that stage where you are counting on Social Security to either supplement or fully support yourself, it
Hmm.
matters. And we have to take that long term because that's how are we taking care of ourselves as we, go through the different phases of life.
Well, and it's got obviously you mentioned retirement, but it's got an impact throughout earlier years too. I mean, we often talk about health implications. If women have fewer resources, what that means for their health. We don't have any kind of guaranteed health care in this country. Women with fewer resources throughout life are going to have fewer opportunities for good health care. It has implications for life choices and independence. People who've studied intimate partner violence often talk about the fact that economic dependence is such a huge contributor to that. If women have more economic independence, they have the opportunity to leave an abuser. It's just it's light years difference, but economic dependence drives so many other factors in our life.
Well, and Scott, I want to pause on that a moment just to say I had a really interesting conversation within the last couple of weeks where I used the term financial, I don't know if I used financial abuse or financial control or some context of that. And the person, so we're in, and I just think we're in 2025. And when we say that, they're like, what do you mean? And I'm like, when a partner is completely dependent on the other for income or money or here's your allowance or this is what I'm going to allow you to have and the control and um just unhealthy nature of not being able to make choices based on I don't have any other options because I don't have a path to support myself
Hmm.
is a part of the abuse cycle when you look at a wheel of and I think people only think physical when it comes to abuse, but there's so many other layers to it. And
Absolutely.
economic is a big piece of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Why do we see this? Let's get into that. I think it's pretty clear what we see, that we do have this disparity. It is not going away. It varies somewhat at age groups. Younger women, there's greater parity in general. As we've mentioned, older women, it widens, but it's there across. So one of the reasons, and I think we've talked about this in other contexts, is it's called occupational segregation, and how women tend to be in lower paying jobs. They tend to be more likely to be in retail, in the lower paying social services, in the lower strata of education, in the lower strata of healthcare, health aides. So even in the lower stratas of management. And again, this is all data which is very objective. We can pull that out easily. So women tend to be in the lower, less well-paid rungs. They segregate, quote unquote, into these jobs. There's a lot of reasons why, but we have to remember again that women are 70% of minimum wage earners, and the minimum wage has not kept up with inflation. In 1970, you could potentially have a minimum wage job and take reasonable care of yourself and your family. But because minimum wages have not kept up with inflation, that's absolutely out of the question now. So occupational segregation is a big one.
And I just, again, I love to repeat things, but the fact that of minimum wage workers, 70% are women. That's a big number.
Yeah, it's a very big number. So, and occupational segregation, some people see that as women choosing employment that pays less. And in a sense, there's some truth to that. I really am always careful to be really honest and factual. Women may be choosing that. And then it's important to say why. What is it that's leading to those choices? Remember, they aren't always choosing it. For example, they may not be promoted in management. So this isn't always voluntary, but women may choose it. And a lot of that has to do with the expectations of families. Some of it has to do with the cultural biases that are built in. Some of it has to do with discrimination that leads them to opt out of certain jobs or certain sectors. Engineering, some tech sectors, etc., have historically been very hostile to women. Some places are changing, some firms are changing, but historically they've been very hostile to women. So women opt out of those, you might say for very sensible reasons, but at a great cost over time.
Well, and when we talk about systemic barriers, and I think that you and I both are firm believers that we want people to have the opportunity to take care of themselves, support themselves, drive toward self-sufficiency. But care economy, childcare, the cost of childcare will lead some women, if that's their responsibility in the family or they're a single mom, they don't have options of, I can only work 4 hours a day because that's the available childcare educational system that's available, and I can't afford, or I don't have the support system to help give me more time to earn money. And I mean, that's such a cycle of poverty that's really hard to break. So it's not about pull yourselves up by the bootstraps, which is one of my least favorite terms, but it's just that there's some real barriers that play into the pay gap and the wealth gap.
Yeah, the pay gap in some circles is often called the motherhood gap.
Mm-hmm.
Because in some industries, you don't see the difference for women who or do not become mothers. And that's very interesting. And economists can pull that out, and people who study labor employment can pull that out. So there are definitely some industries where if women do not have children, they can pretty much stay on par with other men in a comparable industry. So it's frequently called the motherhood penalty. Again, we know that women have family responsibilities, even if they do not have children. It may be elder care, it may be home care, it may be other dependents. They may have a husband who needs physical or health care, but they still bear the burden of all those family and home responsibilities. So women do have diminished opportunities. They have diminished opportunities also to advance because they can't spend the time and extra time that goes into it. They may not be able to have extra time for more education. So there's what's called a motherhood penalty on advancement. I mean, people only have 24 hours in a day. And if you have family responsibilities that are above what your average man has, it's simply not possible to devote that to the workplace. And obviously, this then feeds into these cultural expectations of women. It does become a vicious circle. Women do have to stop out, maybe take part-time work or work with fewer responsibilities or shift their job or step out when they have young children. And that feeds into the further cultural expectations that that's women's role. And I will say, in defense of men here a minute, many men would like to, but there's often a stigma against men doing family work and for men stepping out. And often many companies, I've talked to men who've said that they really feel personally it would be incredibly damaging for their career to say, I took 3 years off, to take care of a small child at home. And I'm very empathetic to that. I think it's very important that we talk about family leave, which isn't to say that women have not historically carried the burden and they still carry the burden. But if we want to start to equalize this, we've also got to reduce the stigma for men as well.
Well, and I think being aware of the words we use and the language we use around it, because I do think there is that just assumption that it's always going to be the woman.
Hmm.
And I could see where that's hard for men. And I think being less the competition, or competition's not the right word, the judgment we give when someone chooses a different path than we do is be aware of, or people
Yes.
trying to create a a conflict where it doesn't need to exist, to say Scott chose to do something differently than me and that makes her worth being an enemy about, or like it's the for women who choose to and have the ability to, or men, to stay at home and provide that care, that should be their choice and celebrated if that's what they want to do. So there, that judgment of your life has to look like my life.
Yeah, we can banish that. I
Yeah.
also want to say too, it's so much a factor in our society because we have so few generalized social services compared to so many other countries. Social services equalize those things. If everybody has, let's just look at the healthcare example before we even get into childcare. Social services, which come to you by virtue of you being a human versus your marital status, your employment status, that's an equalizer. And we have, compared to certainly other Western democracies, but compared to many other countries as well, very, very, very few social services that come to us. So it does fall to individual families to figure out how to do this, and as you say, to make their own choices. But before we get off the sort of occupational segregation and the extra burden women carry, I don't want to suggest that there is no discrimination in the workplace because we know there is discrimination in the workplace, and this can also be tracked. And we do see how women don't advance. We do see that the CEOs, CFOs, COOs of major corporations are still almost exclusively male. So we do know that there's some bias and discrimination. Some of it is soft. It's our expectations of what a leader is like. Some of it has to do with this extra time that one is available for the workplace. Some of it has to do with cultural biases that men with families need more. They're the providers, and therefore we tend to favor them in the workplace. And some of it has to do with out and out discrimination in places that don't believe women can do the same job, don't belong in that workplace, don't fit in, etc. So we do know, again, some industries seem to be worse than others. It's not across the board, but we do know there's also out and out discrimination and bias, regardless of women's choices.
Well, and I think that you referenced, as we're talking about the wealth gap, that there was a Pew research report that showed that there was absolutely a difference in how people were treated. Yes.
There is, and attitudes toward it. And what's interesting is women are much more likely to see bias. Not surprising, they would be experiencing it. It's hard to see something if you're not personally experiencing it very often. But half of all adults in the US said they do think employers treat women differently. So it's not like a secret there. You've got half of working people who willingly say, yeah, we think women are treated differently. And this is not just women, of course. So we know there's an issue. I want to talk some more about the wealth gap, though, if we can
Mhm.
go on, because the wealth gap is like the pay gap accumulating over time, but there's other factors to it. Women tend to invest less. They're much more likely to have financial advisors, which can help people, even if you've accumulated some sort of nest egg or kitty. the financial services industry is still overwhelmingly male. It is a very uncomfortable place for many women, and I think that's important. That some of it is what I call soft. It's how women feel about it. Do they feel they can ask the right questions? Some of it is a confidence. I've known a lot of men who, frankly, know nothing about investing, but they seem to think that it's part of what comes with the trade. There's also a gender debt gap. Women are much, much more likely to carry student debt, for example, and women are being more highly educated, much more likely to carry student debt. So these kind of things accumulate. And another one is entrepreneurship. People historically can build wealth in this country, thank you, through entrepreneurship. Much harder for women to get seed capital, much harder for women to get venture capital. It is just not nearly as acceptable. Those doors aren't open to them. Some of the informal channels are not open. So that's a little bit of a barrier to building wealth as well.
Well, and I want to just tag on to the financial services piece
Yeah.
of I remember having conversations with some female financial advisors of some studies being done, and we'll find it and include it in the notes of, you hit on it, the confidence that, truly women, when we talk about being well suited for, or, occupational segregation, financial services would be something that really trends to women's natural gifts of being empathetic, having those conversations. What is it going to look like? But more
Communication
men are,
skills, yes, in
yeah,
theory.
more men have their confidence, the competitiveness, or make riskier investments and all of those things. So there's some real data around why women really tend to thrive more in that. But you're right. I think part of it is the discomfort of getting engaged.
Hmm.
And so I think that's important to look at.
And when we talk about what can we do, I think this is one also where people can make soft changes. If you're in a home or a family gathering, who sits around and talks about money and their investments? Again, many people don't talk about it at all. But if anybody talks about savings or how you're going to finance something, or even like a mortgage, most people might have mortgages. If it tends to be male dominated conversations around a dinner table or Thanksgiving or whatever the heck it is, that's an issue. That's very much a thing that we can start to normalize, in our homes, in our workplaces. Even whether it's small thing, what are interest rates? Do people follow that? Do women follow that? They often say men used to read the business news. I mean, I'm not sure who's reading these things in paper form anymore
Right.
anyway, but that's always the adage. And I think it's important that women can normalize getting some of that information, even at modest levels. You don't have to have a lot, but to think about your savings, to think about a little bit of investing, think how you're financing things, how do mortgages work, the things that most people will encounter. How does my debt work? What are the differences between different kinds of credit cards? Just to normalize that that's terrain that they're perfectly capable of dealing with, because many women will grow up unfamiliar with those conversations. And I
Well,
think that
and
the confidence.
destigmatize getting information and asking questions.
Yeah, yeah.
So, I think that sometimes we get ourselves in traps of like, well, I don't want to look like I don't know what I'm talking about.
Mhm, mhm.
And it's perfectly okay. And there's lots of resources, I think, that are available to say, all right, I don't want to have this conversation with fill in the blank in my family, but I have a professional or a resource I could reach out to educate and inform. Like, education and information, game
Yeah,
changer.
yeah,
Yeah.
no, totally. And
What
having
else?
that agency and the confidence to do it, it feeds upon itself. So, what else can we do? We
What?
just talked about information and normalizing some of these conversations at home. Some of the other things that I think about what we can do, and we've got a kind of basket of government policies for people who
Mhm.
want to hope that that changes. There's private sector, and then there's family and soft, the kinds of networks we talk about. I think at the government level, certainly increasing the minimum wage wouldn't hurt. I don't know how likely that's going to be, but that's a big one. We've talked about how many women make minimum wage. An increase in the minimum wage is a big thing. Universal health care, which is not on our agenda at any time soon at a national level, but that kind of thing makes a huge change for women. certainly childcare and elder care policies. And I know we're going to talk about childcare, just childcare next week. So
Mhm.
that would be a great conversation. Also, too, family leave policies. We don't really have mandates for family leave policies. And for larger companies, especially, to start to build that in, I think is very, very important.
Well, and when you look at generational shifts,
Hmm.
if we can change the narrative of how we talk about these things within our family dynamics, it's then changing for the next generation of looking at it as a more, it's a family opportunity, not just one member of the family opportunity. I think that can just change conversations and how we
Wait,
work.
what do you mean, Ashley? I'm not sure I understand.
So if you are changing how you're talking about childcare, taking care of an elder parent for being a family issue and not just the female issue,
Oh, okay.
it
Yes.
then changes what the expectation of that next generation coming up
Yes.
because they
Yes.
saw dad,
Yes.
uncle, aunt, mom collectively working toward instead of, oh, I'm female, so it's my role to take care of family.
Yes. And I think that's super important. It is not at all trivial. I do not think that we should all just look to some sort of government changes, especially if they're not on the horizon. But that's ridiculous. A lot of this socialization does start at the bottom. It starts in our families, in our relationships. And I agree with you completely on multi-generational. You know, you're modeling, we're modeling for our children, our grandchildren, nieces, nephews, whoever might be around,
Mhm.
that we talk about those things. I often say to people, when someone is considering a new job, do you say to them, hey, what are their family leave policies? I don't know if you will need those or not, but normalize that that should be the kinds of things when people talk about benefits. Have they asked about family leave policies? Maybe there aren't any, but you've got to start asking about it and really bring that into the conversation so it's kind of bubbling up from above with different expectations.
Well, and when we do look at the government piece of it, because our representatives are representing our voice in developing policies that impact us, what are your elected officials' stances on access to child care or family leave or minimum wage or, fill in the blank? And right now, we're under 30% of female representation. And again, not all females represent equally or are in alignment with what's good for pay equity or wealth
And not
equity.
all males are opposed to it,
And not all males are opposed. So, but
but
being more engaged in who is representing you and what are they supporting? I think that um, there's so much noise that's much more exciting to fight about or talk about. But when you get down to the basics of it, you can get a lot of information on who the people are that are representing you, how they're voting, and we should all be more engaged in that because those are the things that are making a difference. So,
and it's super foundational as it builds over time. And just I want to say one more thing about private sector.
mhm,
Do we have leave for that? Do we have time for that, Ashley?
we do have to, of course, we are like, it's only gonna be 10 minutes. Yeah, we got time.
Um, pay transparency. Pay transparency. And this is such a tough one. We have such a cultural bias in this country about talking about what people make. I mean, people will say intimate details about their sex life, I swear, before they tell you what their salary is. It's like the last taboo in America. But companies have to start to find ways to have pay equity. People have to demand it. We cannot identify pay discrimination without pay transparency. And that's a huge issue. And again, it's a thing that I think we can start to change moving up. I always say to young people when they're looking for jobs or talking, I said, ask people, especially early on. Many people start with kind of more median income. Early on, start asking people, if you leave college or something or wherever it is, hey, what do you make for that? How much does
Mhm,
that
mhm.
pay? And expect honesty and share what you make. And I know it's very, very personal. It's tough, but if companies don't have pay equity, then it's so hard to identify discrimination and it's so hard for people to get accurate information.
Well, and to tie a thread to a previous episode we did, some of the shifts in the DEI world
Mhm.
are going to make it even harder to track some of these gaps in those pieces. So
Yeah.
it all
And there was
matters.
recently an executive order that rescinded, this one killed me, rescinded protections for workers who talked about their pay. So if you're working along at your job and you talk or you ask about other pay, you used to be protected from discrimination. The company could not come and go after you, fire you, whatever, simply for talking about what people made. And that protection has now been lifted, thank you to Executive Order 11246. So that's something our administration just recently enacted. On that happy note,
On a happy note, so what are our key takeaways before we
uh,
wrap up
this
another episode?
this pay gap is real and it's not going anywhere, and it affects everything. It affects, and it's something we can all do something about. We can all start to talk about it, normalize it, ask about it, suspend judgment for men who are caregivers, all that kind of thing. We can all start in the home, in the family, in addition to working up through governments and companies. I think that's one of the first things that's important.
Absolutely. Well, and I think recognizing what is that? You have to admit you have a problem before you can solve it.
Yes. It's not going away by itself.
I
It is
know.
not going away by itself. In fact, in 2023, it widened a little bit, and that was a little nerve-wracking. The pay gap widened a little bit. We had this little 2023 blip. Let's hope it was just a blip, but it was not a good sign.
It did. And as always, time goes too fast.
Time
Thank
goes
you for
fast.
this great conversation. Next time we are talking about childcare, and we're going to have a guest. So, Brittany Lamont, who is participating on childcare task force from the business
Yep.
angle, which is really important. So, looking forward to that. And in the meantime, we've got lots of references to share in this episode. So make sure you check out links if you're more interested in getting data reports, etc. And Scott, as always, I
Thank you,
leave better every time we have a conversation.
Ashley. Always a pleasure.
Yeah.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.